Mom said, "Born ugly, die ugly." Then helped sister abandon her kids at my house. Now I'm suing them both after they tried to destroy my career. My sister always had her way. No matter how cruel or unreasonable she was towards me, she always got away with it because she was the golden miracle child. My sister's outstanding beauty most certainly contributed to this as well. She had thick, wavy hair and light eyes, and my mother spent a lifetime comparing our appearances. I had dark eyes and straight hair, but I was never as attractive as my sister. My mother loved to make comparisons between us. After we both became teenagers, she was continually encouraging me to dress like my sister and begging her to teach me makeup. However, if I ever sought my sister for help making myself more attractive, she would ridicule and mock me. That's how we grew up to be so resentful of one another. I believe my sister simply adopted the worst characteristics that we witnessed in my mother, whereas I rejected them completely. I believe that my mother's constant putting her on a pedestal for her beauty has made her into a horrible person who doesn't care about anyone but herself and believes she can get away with anything because of her attractiveness. My mother's comparisons and criticism of me caused me to have low self-esteem, and as an adult, I am extremely quiet and reserved. Some folks call me a pushover. I recently started attending therapy to try to strengthen my spine. Even though it has been difficult for me to assert myself in my relationships for the first time, I believe that the way my family treated me harmed me as an adult. It's difficult for me to establish strong friendships and love connections. My sister even slept with my boyfriend in high school during senior year, for no apparent reason. She never liked him and told me repeatedly that she thought he was ugly. When my parents discovered what had transpired, they told me to let go of the past. My sister wasn't even given away, which made me realize how much they preferred her over me. The way my father basically stood by and watched my mother emotionally get under my skin for my entire life made me believe that no man would ever stand up for me or see value in me, and it's extremely difficult for me to trust and connect when dating. But my entire life hasn't been absolutely miserable because of my mother and sister. Because one advantage of being the ugly sister growing up was that I had no social life and spent all of my time studying. I graduated high school with a 4.0 and received a full ride to my top university choice, which was fantastic because my mother informed me the night before I started high school that she was paying for my sister's college because she was the eldest, but I would have to go to community college and pay my own way through it. I remember sobbing and begging Mom why she didn't love me as much as she loved my sister, and she argued that she did, but my sister deserved it more because she was her first child. I spent the entire day excited to tell my parents about my scholarship. I believe a part of me felt relieved to have something that my sister did not. My sister had spent all of her high school years partying and achieving low grades with no repercussions from my parents, and she was only attending college because my parents could afford it. She wasn't even going to a good one because her grades were so low. So when I rushed home to tell my family that I had received a full ride to a top university, I had never been more pleased to share good news with them. But when I returned home and told my parents about my scholarship, all my father said was "good job," and my mother didn't glance up from her phone or respond. Then she ignored me for a week after I told her the news. I tried to ask her why she was upset with me for receiving a college scholarship, but she simply avoided making eye contact with me and walked into another room. It felt as if Mom despised me for receiving my scholarship when most parents would be overjoyed. Whatever. That's when I realized how alone I was, and how isolated my family wanted me to feel. I didn't understand why, either. Why had my mother given birth to me if she was going to spend her entire life loathing me, and thereby making me loathe myself? The day I received my scholarship turned out to be one of the worst days of my life, as I wept myself to sleep and accepted that I would never have a family who loved me the way my sister did. I detested her for it. That night, I wrote in my journal until the sun rose about my plans for the rest of my life. I was tired of being this miserable little kid, so I was determined to channel all of my hatred into academic accomplishment. Instead of throwing myself a pity party and begging my parents for love and attention, I was going to devote all of my focus and energy to my academics, like I always had, and give myself something they could never provide. I was going to be stable, independent, bright, and educated, even if I was never loved. So that is exactly what I did. I attended school and finished with honors. I obtained a great job at a company I interned for right out of college, and I've been making six figures since I was 23. When I returned home for the holidays, I would tell my family how I was doing and receive occasional praises from extended family members, but my own parents never went out of their way to recognize or congratulate me on my accomplishments. As an adult, I knew better than to tell my mother about my high position at my job or how much I was earning, since I knew it would just make her despise me more. But I told my father, and one year he even told me how glad he was for me. It was the greatest thing my folks had ever said to me. But even as an adult, my mother treated me like an unwanted guest. And even though I only saw them around the holidays, she would do everything she could to divert their focus away from me if they asked me a question or directed the conversation toward me. For example, one year over Christmas dinner, my uncle congratulated me on a promotion I had mentioned to him earlier in the day. It was my second promotion with the company, and I had received a hefty rise as well. I had been telling him that I was looking at buying my first home. My uncle mentioned the promotion and the potential house, and a few other extended family members thanked me and were surprisingly positive about the news. Another of my cousins asked me what region I was looking for a house in, and that's when my mother stopped me off and said, "This is boring. Can we change the subject?" Then, under her breath, I heard her remark, "It's probably not even true." I ended up buying my house later that year, and when I announced it on social media, everyone in my family appreciated it, except my mother. I realized she was probably angry since my sister had an entirely different life experience than me. She had attended college right out of high school, all paid for by my parents, but failed out and became pregnant by her first college lover. I had a sneaking notion that my parents had encouraged her to end the pregnancy, but she kept it and tried to work it out with the baby dad, whom she had only known for 4 months. It turns out they were absolutely incompatible. But I suppose it didn't stop them from attempting to make things work, or repair their relationship by having another child. When I saw her post about having a second child, I had to hold back tears since I knew the baby would most likely be born into a toxic atmosphere because my sister, and her baby dad, were such nasty people. I encountered him around the holidays, but he never remembered my name or engaged in conversation with me. Every year, he would bring home platters of food despite the fact that he had brought nothing. Obviously, my sister and I's relationship deteriorated as we grew older, and we barely spoke after we both moved out of our parents' house. We had each other on social media, and the few times we saw each other around the holidays, my sister would make disparaging remarks about my weight or the way I dressed. I honestly believe she was just projecting, because I wear a lot of fancy clothes and enjoy cycling through my designer purses. She kept asking me what phony purse I had brought this time. One year, as soon as I stepped into the house for Thanksgiving, Mom looked me up and down and remarked literally, "I see you're dressed up again like the stuck-up bitch you are." It was incredibly disrespectful and uncalled for. Despite the fact that her children were still little, she would regularly insult me in front of them, using profanity and everything. I don't feel guilty admitting that my sister is complete garbage, and I don't feel bad about whatever I did after she put her kids on my doorstep out of nowhere. One Saturday morning, I was relaxing in my house after a long work week when my doorbell rang, and I was utterly surprised to see my sister's 10 and 7-year-olds standing on my front porch, clutching overnight bags. When I asked what they were doing here, they explained that their mother was going on vacation for 8 weeks, and that she had told them I was watching them. My sister and I hadn't spoken since our family's July 4th BBQ, when she warned me not to eat more than one plate because she was tired of staring at my muffin top. I had no idea why she assumed I would be her free babysitter for 2 months. My nephews were good, quiet kids who were clearly puzzled, so I let them in while I called my sister. My sister rejected my first 10 calls, but I kept calling until she answered. As soon as she picked up, I told her that there was no way I was watching her children, and that if she didn't come to pick them up herself as soon as possible, I would call CPS on her. I was practically Googling the number for Child Protective Services as she was speaking to me when she dropped a bombshell. Her voice became extremely deep and frightening as she blackmailed me, threatening to phone my employer and warn them that I was not taking my bipolar medication, resulting in my termination. Even though my sister was an idiot who knew nothing about my profession, my career was the most important thing to me, and I couldn't risk losing my position there. I simply hung up after she said that and attempted to figure out what to do next. I felt like my head was about to explode from tension. Not only could I not care for her kids, but I had a month-long trip planned to see my long-distance boyfriend Greg in Australia and meet his family for the first time. We'd been dating for a long time, and I had been looking forward to this vacation all year. It was extremely crucial since he was introducing me to his mother and father, and I wanted everything to go smoothly. My life was now in disarray as a result of my sister's actions, and I had no idea what to do. I had no idea who else to call to save my mother, and I shouldn't have been surprised when she sided with my sister, as she had always done. I told my mother that my sister hadn't even been to drop off her own children, and she stated they were big enough to come to my place on their own anyhow. My mother began guilting me, telling me that my sister had done so much for me, and that I needed to be there for her just once, because I had never been. That made me lose my mind, and I screamed at her at the top of my lungs, asking her to tell me one single moment when my sister helped me or improved my life in any manner. I informed my mother that she and my sister had never been there for me and treated me as if I were an unwashed dog in their home rather than a member of their own family. I demanded that my mother visit me so that, in the worst-case scenario, I could leave her at home while I flew to Australia to care for my nephews instead of myself. I had very little faith that my sister would abandon her vacation to return for her children, given how quickly she dumped them on me. When my mother finally arrived at my house, she was as icy as ever, staring at me with the same nasty gaze she always had for me. We sat down in my living room, and my mother told me that I was being an awful sibling to my sister as usual, and she lectured me on the importance of family being there for one another in times of need. I ignored my mother's compliments and demanded to know exactly what kind of vacation my sister was taking. It was so crucial that she would forget about her children and leave them with someone who essentially despised her, despite being her own sister. I told my mother that everything about this was strange and suspicious, that my sister departing for 8 weeks out of nowhere and leaving 2 young children behind made no sense, and that I wanted to know the truth if I was going to be engaged without consent like this. That's when my mother's expression changed, and she eventually disclosed to me that my sister wasn't just taking a holiday, she was being flown out by her sugar daddy. I literally chuckled when she said this because I assumed she was joking, but her expression was dead serious. I was so emotionally weary at this time that I flipped out on my mother, asking her how she could be good with it in any manner. I informed her that she had created a complete loser of a daughter who fled the nation to see a sugar daddy rather than simply getting a job to support her children. My mother, of course, retaliated and supported my sister as she always did. At one point, she even stated that no matter how much money I had or how gorgeous my house was, I would always be the ugly duckling in comparison to my sister. Born ugly, and you're going to die ugly. After she said that, I had to stop myself from seizing her shirt and throwing her out of the house. When I yelled at my mother to get the heck out of my house, she replied that she was not going anywhere. When I tried to direct her out of the room, she shoved me into a coffee table that held one of my favorite vases. My lover had given it to me the last time he visited, and it was one of my favorite possessions. But as my mother shoved me into the coffee table, it tumbled to the floor and broke into a bunch of little pieces. Looking at the shattered vase on the floor made me feel just as devastated, and I believe I had a complete mental breakdown. I began yelling and crying at my mother, telling her to leave my house or I would call the police. I feel terrible because my nephews could clearly hear me from the other room, but I was a mess at the time. It had been a long and hard day. After I eventually got my mother out of the house, my nephews popped their heads out of the room and inquired if everything was okay. Their eyes were big, and they appeared anxious and sorrowful, which crushed my heart. Even though I didn't know them very well, they were just kids with a disaster of a mother, and I felt terrible for them at the time. I ordered DoorDash for everyone and let them watch movies and video games in my living room until they passed out. When I eventually got through to her, I immediately began ranting at her for absolutely destroying my life, and I mentioned CPS once more. My sister just gave me a wicked laugh over the phone and informed me that I had a choice: watch her kids or lose my job. She snarled at one point, saying she knew I was nothing without my job and would revert to being a loser without it. This struck me in the heart because it was the absolute truth. I had a degree and a strong resume, but I was deeply attached to my professional success and would go to any length to maintain it. At that time, I was crying and asking my sister why she hated me so much and why she had abandoned her young children for a sugar daddy. She simply stated that she was the type of lady who could make millions from a sugar daddy in 2 months. And I never had to worry about it. I believe she was just trying to break me down and make me feel tiny at that point, so I gave up. And frankly, it was working. We went back and forth for a while until my sister literally hung up on me after a final threat to notify my employer, and I burst into tears again, understanding that I had no influence over her. My nephews were downstairs watching a movie in the living room, so I had some privacy upstairs and decided to phone my boyfriend. I hadn't spoken to him since my nephews were left on my doorstep, and I ended up breaking down and talking to him about the entire incident. I could not hold back tears as I informed him about my sister's threats, my mother's continuing disdain, and how I felt absolutely trapped by my sister. Even though he lives on the other side of the world, my partner made me feel loved and supported, and he was literally the only one in my corner. And I'm so grateful for that. He stated that my sister was potentially committing many crimes by abandoning her children and threatening me with career blackmail, and that I needed to gather solid evidence of her acts. He suggested that I contact my sister again and try to persuade her to repeat her threat regarding the phony medical accusations. But this time, secretly record the discussion as evidence. My partner was aware of my history with my sister and mother, and he pointed out that my sister was plainly insane, and it wouldn't take much for her to act on the threat. He told me to do everything I could to prepare. Of course, hearing it terrified me. But he was absolutely correct. I knew my sister was insane more than anyone else, so I chose to follow his plan. Even though I was still feeling emotionally overwhelmed by everything that was going on, I wanted my nephews to feel safe and cared for. I understood what it was like to be a child in a family where you were unwanted, and I never wanted to make these innocent little guys, who were connected to me, feel that way. I went downstairs and spent some time with them playing a multiplayer video game, which turned out to be a lot of fun. They were amazed that I knew how to play first-person shooters, and they were adorable as they giggled and laughed as they watched me answer call after call. I wasn't expecting to bond with them after such a stressful weekend, but when we all ordered pizza and had a contest to see who could eat the most pepperoni, I found I genuinely liked the two little boys. They were nothing like their mother. Even though I knew my sister wouldn't have been a good parent, they were both quite courteous. And, while it took some time for them to come out of their shells, they were both very sweet and hilarious little guys. They were quite good at cleaning up after themselves and were constantly saying, "Please," and "Thank you." As I hung around with my nephews throughout the afternoon, I saw that they both had holes in their socks, and my elder nephew's clothes appeared a little short for him. I went through the rest of the clothes my sister had brought for them and found they were all either too old or too small for the boys. Again, I wasn't surprised that my sister was a cheap, irresponsible parent, so I took my nephews to the mall to get some new clothes. I almost stabbed several times on that excursion to the mall because my nephews burst out of their shells and were running around the mall, joyful and happy. As I previously stated, I knew what it was like to be a neglected child, and all I wanted them to know was that they could have whatever they wanted, that I was there for them, and that I wanted to make them happy. So whenever we walked past a window and they expressed an interest in going into a store, we went in, and I kept buying them whatever they wanted. It was impossible not to. My youngest nephew was missing 2 front teeth, and every time he gave me his funny little hollow smile, my heart wrenched, and I felt compelled to purchase him another small treat or toy. They left the shopping that day with new clothes that looked wonderful on them and fit comfortably, as well as both Nintendo Switches, which I had purchased. It was really hard not to treat them. I didn't have children of my own, and I had plenty of money to purchase them the little things they desired. When I handed them the Switches, they both burst into tears and hugged me, and I spotted the 10-year-old crying again on the journey home. I asked whether he was all right. He stared at me through tears in his eyes and wondered why I was so nice to them, and why they deserved it. I told him that they deserved my care since they were also my guys, and that they were children, which meant they deserved to be happy. This simply made him weep harder, and he informed me that he was unhappy with his mother for keeping us apart. This hurt my heart, and I apologized for not getting to know him previously, but I was so glad he and his brother were here with me now, even if I hadn't expected it. I asked him about his home life, and the answers were exactly what I expected. My elder and younger nephews gradually began to open up to me about how horribly their mother treated them at times. When I heard this, my heart felt like it had shattered into a million pieces. I knew my sister and her baby dad were terrible people who were most likely doing it, but hearing it directly from their mouths and hearing the sorrow in their voices was something else. When we arrived home, I cooked a big meal for everyone, and they spent the rest of the night playing on their Switches together. I left them alone in the living room to contact my sister again from my room, ready to carry out the strategy my boyfriend had devised. This time, I tried to remain calm and composed on the phone, despite my wanting to call my sister every name in the book. It wasn't difficult to direct the conversation toward the medical claim. When I brought up CPS again, my sister freaked out and threw the threat at me, screaming that I would be fired for being a crazy in secret, and that she didn't care if I was taking my medicine or not. No one would know if she was lying. She just continued telling me that no one would believe a crazy, sick batch like me, and that I didn't deserve my work. I honestly believe my sister was on drugs during this call since she sounded high and kept repeating strange phrases. After I got what I wanted out of the call, I hung up on my sister because she continued telling me that I didn't deserve anything in this world. I didn't deserve anything, over and over. Whatever. I put her remarks out of my head as I checked to see that I had correctly captured the entire call. I had my sister recorded on audio indicating she was planning to file bogus medical claims against my company. I recognized how brilliant my boyfriend had been to recommend acquiring this recording, and I began emotionally preparing myself for the consequences if my sister followed through on her threat. After receiving the recording, I tried to calm myself and put my nephews to bed. The next morning, before they awoke, I called CPS as soon as the line was open and reported the entire event. I mentioned that my sister had abandoned her children, and that we were entirely separated. I even went so far as to suggest that she had not only abandoned them, but had done so under false pretenses, and then used manipulation and compulsion to force me to care for them. I was shocked to find that CPS was actually rather helpful, and I shared the recording with them. The agent I met with listened to the recording and stated that it was evident that my sister was using blackmail to neglect her children, and was undoubtedly committing a litany of crimes. The agent informed me that they would begin an investigation immediately, and that my sister would be notified as soon as possible. I was shivering after the conversation, so I tried to decompress as much as possible and spent the remainder of the day relaxing and connecting with my nephews. My mom called me the next day, and I'm not sure why I answered. I guess I was still bewildered and emotionally sensitive, and I ended up having another massive fight with her over the phone. I told her I had called CPS and that my sister would eventually pay for the way she treated me, and my mother hung up as soon as I said that. I'll be honest. I was shaking after those calls. Just making the call to CPS was nerve-wracking, and then fighting with my mother over the phone and telling her about CPS felt like a tremendous mistake. I didn't regret calling CPS, but I knew my mother would do everything to protect my sister and didn't care about my nephew's safety, just like my sister. All I knew about my mother was that she hated me and loved my sister, and I had no idea what would happen next. There was no way my mother wasn't going to contact my sister right away after learning that I had contacted CPS and tried to put her 2 steps ahead. I was certain she had hung up the phone on me to call my sister right away, and there was no way my sister wouldn't find out about my call to CPS by the next day. I had a restless night, and the next morning, when I got to work, my receptionist informed me that my supervisor had booked a meeting with me before lunch, indicating that it was important. As frightened as I was to learn about this unexpected meeting, I knew it was coming. And, as I already stated, I knew my sister was insane, and she was clearly out to ruin my life. I sat in the conference and cracked my knuckles to relieve the tension I was experiencing. My 2 supervisors were present, as was a higher-up whom I had never met before. They all looked at me suspiciously, and I felt like a bug under a microscope. Sure enough, they told me that they had been contacted by a trustworthy member of my family, and had been advised that I was potentially unmedicated for a severe mental condition. They also told me that they had been provided detailed information about previous mental problems I had had, and that they were afraid about me having a psychotic break in the office. But neither they nor my sister realized how well I had prepared for today's encounter. Of course, I knew my sister would follow through on her promise. She had always despised me, and being able to take my high-paying job would be the ultimate "screw you" to her ugly little sister, and I knew she wouldn't hesitate to do so. But she would relish it. If I hadn't been minding her nephews, or if I hadn't called CPS, I'm sure she would have kept it over my head and blackmailed me into doing whatever she wanted me to do for her. So, in some ways, I was relieved to be dealing with this and getting my sister's issues resolved. I took out my briefcase and handed each of the managers a copy of my doctor's letter, as well as the associated documents proving that I had been adhering to my medication routine. There was proof that I had never missed a prescription pickup date, and that both my medication and my moods had been consistent over the previous nearly 5 years. My primary care physician, as well as my therapist and psychiatrist, all confirmed my diagnosis. I gave my supervisors an informative but concise explanation of the issues in my family, as well as my sister's own mental health struggles, and informed them that the claims were completely unfounded, and that they could be confident in my stability based on all of the medical documentation I was providing for them. My supervisors took some time to go through all of the paperwork, but once they saw that I had medical evidence from multiple MDs, they seemed completely satisfied, and even apologized to me for the inconvenience of calling me into this meeting. They explained that they only had a responsibility to conduct due diligence before closing this case. My one supervisor even used the meeting to congratulate me on a successful quarter and brag about my performance to the other supervisors, which made me look good. I literally left the meeting giggling because of how well it had gone, regardless of the reason, and thinking about how badly my sister's moronic plan had failed. I couldn't concentrate on my work for the rest of the day because I kept smiling stupidly every time I remembered how I got to call my sister after work and tell her how her plan had failed miserably. I called my sister as soon as I got back to my car that day and nearly burst out laughing as I told her how the meeting had only lasted about 15 minutes, because she had sounded insane and stupid on the phone, and my bosses had never believed her in the first place. My sister became enraged and accused me of lying, claiming that she was certain I had been fired and that I was simply trying to save face. This made me laugh even harder, and I told her that she had failed at everything in her life, including trying to get me fired. I told her that as a woman approaching 40, the only skills she possessed were lying and failing, and that her own children were disappointed in her. My sister lost it again and continued to call me the B word and the C word, claiming that I had completely betrayed her. She said she was getting on the first plane back and was going to make me regret everything I had done to her. I was still laughing after the call, but by the time I got home and reunited with my nephews, who had been in a much better mood since being dropped off at my house, I realized that this situation was far from over and could get worse before it improved. All I knew for certain was that my sister was completely insane, and she was flying home from another country to exact revenge on me. I realized I was truly terrified of what would happen next. My sister had nothing to lose at this point, and she had always been unstable, so I began to fear for my safety. Then I began to think about my nephews. I worried if I had made a mistake by phoning CPS. A large part of me wished my sister had lost her passport overseas and never returned home. I had grown so close to my nephews in the last several days, and I knew my heart would shatter when they had to leave. I did not want to say goodbye to them. I did not want to see them walk back into my sister's arms. She was doing the same thing my mother had done to me, and I knew I despise her more than anyone else on this planet. I checked on my sleeping nephews since I couldn't sleep due to my racing mind, and I cried silently in the hallway after closing the guest room door. They were such innocent little lads, and they deserved none of this. The next day was an absolute shit show. I awoke to the sound of someone knocking on my door, but it sounded like someone slapping a sandbag repeatedly on my front door. When I opened it, there was my sister next to a guy who had to be about 6 feet 5 inches tall and weighed almost 300 pounds. He was massive, and one of his hands was the size of my entire head. I could barely see my mother standing right behind him, and before I could even open my mouth to tell them to get the hell off my property, the man put his hand on my shoulder and shoved me down with all his might. My sister and my mom and the stranger all made their way inside my house, and I collapsed on my floor as soreness sank into my shoulder where the man had thrown me down. I immediately started screaming at my sister for bringing the stranger to my house and screaming at him not to touch me, but he seemed to speak only Russian. I had no idea how this was even happening. And then I realized that my sister had beat CPS to my house. They had been scheduled to come around 11 a.m. that day, but my sister had busted my door down at 8 a.m. My nephews had been woken up by the commotion and were walking out of the guest room with sleepy eyes. At that point, I tried to get in between them and protect them from the stranger, but my sister barked at the man to go put my nephews in the car, causing complete chaos. Once they realized what was going on, both of my nephews began asking my sister to leave them with me. My sister walked over to me as I held my head in my hands, and when I looked up at her, she spit at me square in the face. I sank to the floor and watched him carry my 2 little nephews out of my house. My mother was also crying, but she left with them. It was the most disgusting thing anyone had ever done to me, and one of the worst days of my life. They all drove away in this massive black Suburban that I had never seen my sister in before. I had no idea who the man was, and I couldn't believe the trauma that my sister had just inflicted on everyone. She hadn't even let them take any of their stuff. They had left without any clothes, neither of their switches, nor any breakfast. My heart broke for them, and I had a never-before-seen anxiety attack. I had no idea how much it would hurt to care so much for my nephews, but I seriously loved those boys with all my heart, and I just wanted to protect them and make sure they were cared for, like I had never been when I was their age. But now they were scared and shoeless in some random car with my psychotic sister and a humongous stranger. I was disgusted by my mother's behavior. I couldn't believe she had just stood by and watched that huge man toss me around in my own home and pull my nephews out of their aunt's house without saying a word. I couldn't stop thinking about my nephews and how evil my family had become. After calming down from my anxiety attack, I realized that I needed to take action and that time was of the essence, and I was running out of it. When I finally came to my senses, I immediately called the police, who were already aware of the ongoing investigation due to Child Protective Services involvement and an open case against my sister. My voice was shaking, but I tried to stay steady and focused as I described the stranger. I racked my mind to try to remember the image of the license plate. Fortunately, because of how much responsibility I have in my job, I was used to picking up on and remembering little details that other people ignored, and I somehow managed to. I gave the cops a description of the stranger, the full license plate, and a description of the outfits that my mom and sister were wearing. When my sister came to my house that morning, She looked absolutely feral and had this wild look in her eyes. I believe she had been doing substances since she landed overseas, wherever she was vacationing with her sugar daddy. My sister was insane, but something snapped in her, and I had never seen her act so truly unhinged and detached from reality. After I gave the cops every single detail I could remember about my sister and the car they had driven away in, I hung up and did my best to take my mind off things, but I literally couldn't focus on anything else. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, I couldn't nap, I couldn't watch anything on TV. I just kept seeing I reflected on my mother and how she had always made excuses for my sister, allowing her to grow up to be a truly evil person. I also reflected on my sister's trip, wondering what she had done there, if she really had a sugar daddy, and how much he had paid her. I wondered if the money she had earned on her trip was truly worthwhile. I began to consider what it would be like if it was just me and my nephews. I had room for them, and now I definitely had room for them in my heart. The more I thought about it, the more I wanted that outcome. My sister out of the picture, and just me and my nephews. I could give them everything that my sister couldn't. And if my sister and I ended up in front of a judge in a custody battle over my nephews, the judge would be staring at on. I tried to think positively, but random dark anxieties about my nephew's safety kept leaking into my mind. I wondered if the giant man she had brought into my house was her sugar daddy, and if he was with my nephews. I had just been laying on my couch, staring at the ceiling, overthinking, not realizing how much time had passed, when I finally received a call back from the police station. They had been searching for the Suburban my sister had left in for hours and finally found them. The officer who had called me back was the same one from earlier and continued to be very helpful, sharing a lot of details with me. He told me that they had 3 different police cars on the scene when they went to pull over the black SUV because they knew the man had already been violent that morning. Despite having firearms drawn on him, the man ran forward and tried to attack an officer, getting hit in the thigh. He had punched 2 officers in the head and given a female officer a black eye. My sister had also physically attacked the officer who had initially attempted to handcuff her. I tried to imagine my insane sister and the giant stranger fighting a group of cops on the shoulder of the highway. I couldn't believe that something like this was actually happening in my family, and I wasn't just watching it on reality TV or something. I was still reeling in shock from everything the officer had told me about my sister's arrest, when he began telling me that my sister actually wanted to speak with me. I couldn't believe my ears, and he confirmed that my sister was certain that she wanted to use her one call on me. I asked the officer if he thought she was going to ask me for bail money, and he was honest and said yes. That's what she was screaming about. I told the officer that I wasn't even going to take her call and that she could rot in there for all I cared. The officer ended up giving me an understanding laugh, and I eventually finished the call without speaking to my sister. Even though my sister was finally behind bars where she belonged, I discovered that my nephews were in CPS protection, and while they were safe, I was extremely concerned. I also had only a week until my trip to Australia, and if I didn't go, I would lose thousands of dollars in bookings. Also, as I previously stated, canceling this trip would have been extremely disrespectful to my boyfriend's family before I even had the opportunity to meet them. I had planned to marry my boyfriend one day, and the last thing I wanted to do was give his family a bad first impression of me if I was going to be in their lives forever. I called CPS to check on my nephews and simply asked if I could speak with them, but they refused. I tried to explain that I was family and one of the only mentally stable families they had, but they didn't care. I was dealing with a different department than I had previously contacted, and they were relentless. At that point, I was completely emotionally exhausted, and I had officially run out of options. I spent the rest of the week trying to prepare for my trip, while continuing to burst out in random tears as I remembered my nephews and thought about where they might be. I felt so bad because my boyfriend and I had been looking forward to this trip for so long, and now it was finally here, and I was completely distracted and full of anxiety. During the week leading up to my flight, all of our conversations revolved around how nervous and tense I was feeling. Despite the fact that my boyfriend was always kind and supportive, I was furious at my sister for how she had treated her nephews and me. I couldn't believe how disrupted my life had become as a result of my sister's single decision to go see her stupid sugar daddy. I was grateful that my job had been understanding, but just thinking about how my sister had been so quick to try to get me fired made me feel betrayed and distrustful of anyone in my family. Even my father was off somewhere and not getting involved in all this drama, despite the fact that he was undoubtedly aware of everything. He was spineless, just like my useless mother. My mother didn't even care about her grandchildren. She had encouraged my sister's idiotic decisions, which had resulted in her grandchildren being in the custody of strangers. I was sitting at the airport bar on the day of my trip to Australia, 2 cocktails in, when I began browsing through some photos of my nephews that I had taken when they were visiting with me. We had taken these silly photo booth pictures at the mall all together, and I couldn't help but begin crying all over again over how much I loved and missed them. I decided that would be the last time I cried until I landed back in America, and I told myself that I really needed to try my hardest to enjoy the time with my boyfriend and his family. I had a life too, and I couldn't let my sister ruin it, even from all the way across the globe. My time in Australia turned out to be fantastic. I hadn't seen my boyfriend in months, and when he ran up to me in the airport and picked me up princess style, my heart exploded with joy. I had been through a lot in the previous few weeks, and just being back in the arms of my boyfriend, who was so warm and caring to me, made me feel so healed, and he spent every moment of the trip catering to me. My boyfriend took me on a hike to his favorite secret waterfall, where we skinny dipped, swam, laughed, and kissed for hours. We did a lot of sightseeing together, and his parents turned out to be really fun, active people, and I got along with both of them right away. When I returned home, the nightmare with my sister resumed, so I went to the local police station a few days later to officially press charges against not only my sister but also my mother, for breaking and entering into my home. They had that man literally pick me up and toss me to the side so that they could barge into my house, and I was not going to let that slide. When I went to file the charge, I discovered that the CPS investigation into my sister was still ongoing, and I was disappointed to hear that they hadn't found anything conclusive yet. If they had just spoken to my nephews, they would have understood what they had gone through. Furthermore, my sister had been arrested alongside a man who had attacked multiple cops, and I couldn't see how that wasn't proof that she was clearly an unfit parent for my nephews. I left the police station that day relieved that charges had been filed against my family, but extremely frustrated to learn that the CPS investigation had not yet been completed. I just kept worrying about my nephew's safety and knew that being with strangers couldn't have been good for them, even if it was better than being with my sister. I couldn't stop thinking about how my sister had dragged them out of my house that morning without allowing them to take any of their belongings. My youngest nephew had this little dog plushie that he brought literally everywhere, and I'd been sleeping with it ever since my sister had taken my nephews away that day, and some mornings it made me want to cry just to wake up and see that little plush dog looking back at me. My sister had not even allowed them to put their shoes on, and I just wanted to make things right for them, but I felt powerless until CPS made a decision about a month after my sister was arrested. After phoning CPS every day and demanding information on her case, they reached a decision to officially remove both of my nephews from my sister's custody and place them in protective care. When the CPS agent first explained this to me, I was annoyed. I asked him to explain how this was any different from what had been going on, and they said that it now meant that my sister was not only being taken to court, but she would have to go to court if she wanted custody of her kids ever again. I asked the CPS agent if she was likely to win if she tried to get custody back, and the CPS agent told me that it depends if there are any other, more fitting relatives. I knew right away that that was what I was going to do, so I opened a separate court case to try to win custody of my nephews. I didn't care how long it took, how expensive the legal fees would be, and I chose to hire the best lawyer I could afford to work on my custody case, knowing that it would be one of the most difficult legal battles I could enter. But before the custody case even began, the case I had against my sister for breaking and entering into my home was the first to begin. I know some people might judge me for taking my own sister to court, but I literally would have fist-fought her in a Wendy's parking lot at that point, but I figured I should follow the law if I ever wanted custody of my nephews. At the end of the day, all I wanted was my sister out of the way. On the first day of our trial, I saw my sister in court, and it was the first time we had seen each other since the day she had broken into my house and allowed the man to attack me. The last interaction she and I had had was me looking up at her and her spitting a huge glob of spit directly into my face, so neither of us were excited to see each other. The trial began, and the judge remarked that I had filed a custody case against her for full custody of my nephews. Apparently my sister's public defender had not notified her beforehand, and she found out for the first time in court that day. My sister has never been one to take bad news well, and when the judge told her about my custody charges against her, she snapped. Despite the fact that we were in the middle of a courtroom, she slowly angled her body towards me, screamed my name, and then pounced on me like a crazed hyena. She was clawing and scratching on my face and attempting to rip out chunks of my hair. It didn't take long for the bailiff to come over and pull her off of me, but she managed to bite down extremely hard on my forearm right before he arrived. It was one of the worst pains I'd ever felt in my life, and the bite looked nasty and ended up getting infected. All of this transpired in front of the judge, and when everything settled down, I realized my sister had sealed her fate. It took months and months, almost 2 years, for all of the criminal charges against my sister to be dropped and for her to be permanently imprisoned. She was serving a life sentence as a result of all of her crimes stacking up on top of each other, and there was no way she was going to see the light of day anytime soon, given her slim chances of appeal. I never dropped the breaking and entering charges against my mother, and the only way my mother stayed out of jail was by testifying against my sister in court and throwing her under the bus. I don't think I've ever felt such sweet satisfaction as watching my mother blame my sister for everything that had happened while sobbing her usual crocodile tears. I couldn't believe my mother was finally betraying her perfect golden child, even though it had taken a lifetime and the government's help. I knew that day, looking up at my mother on the stand, that it was the last time I'd ever see her. I'd seen enough of her and my sister for a lifetime, and I was tired of their constant toxicity. My sister had turned my life into a never-ending court struggle, and all I wanted was to live a regular life again. The custody battle for my nephews dragged on. Their birth father and his family began battling me in court for full custody against them, which only drew the case out further. I didn't care. There wasn't a force on earth that could keep me from my nephews now that my sister was imprisoned. It took nearly 2 years of legal fights, but I eventually won full custody of my boys and brought my nephews home. I'll never forget how huge they grinned and hugged me when they arrived home and saw the bedrooms I'd designed for them in my house. When I walked into my youngest nephew's room, he ran to me to show me his rediscovered Switch. I surprised him with his little plush doggy and caught him in a tight hug when he fell into my arms. Before I knew it, my eldest nephew joined us, and both boys cried into my hair and told me how much they miss me. My eldest son glanced up at me, smiled with tear-filled eyes, and simply said, "I knew it, Auntie. I just knew you would come back for us one day."